Hello and welcome to episode 69, nice, of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're going to discuss OpTic Texas's crucial victory ahead of their own major. We also have to, unfortunately, talk about the first team that went 0-5 in this round of qualifiers in this season. And most importantly, we're going to preview the third Call of Duty League major of the season. But before we do any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing well. Can't believe we hit 69 episodes. Such a monumental achievement for us in the pod. So, ready to make this a good one.
Yeah, we've made it over 2 years now. I think we started it in February 2021. And so, yeah, 2 years, over 2 years now. I guess we missed our anniversary. How dare you not wish me, get me anything. But, we have another podcast for you, episode 69, going to be episode 70, which was my high school football number next time around. So, yeah, we probably won't hit 100 by the end of the year, but 100 will be hit probably within the next year or year and a half, hopefully, if we don't take too many breaks like we've done. But yeah. We have a lot to cover, so we should get started. Let's start with these matches from the final week of the qualifiers. And this was a really interesting week, as is pretty much every final week of qualifiers, right? You only have 5 matches per team. So when these teams go into the final week having played sometimes only 3 matches, or 4, a lot of stuff can move around. A lot of teams can either rise or they can fall into that bottom 4 and then have to play through the losers bracket at the next major. One of those teams that was pretty much locked in to the bottom was London, a team that just has not had a lot of success this season. They had a chance to get out, but they had to play Seattle, who were, pun intended, surging over the past few weeks and looking better than normal. So that first match of the week, Seattle versus London, the Surge went 3-1 and essentially secure a place in the winners bracket of the next major. Any thoughts on this match? Because we both had Seattle. We thought London was not really a match for the Surge.
Yeah, I think we've harped on Seattle enough at this point. Comparing them to a seesaw, whatever analogy you're looking at, but they're up right now, and they're trending in the right direction at a good time. So this was, an important win for them in the sense of making sure they lock in the best seed possible, which eventually turns into that number 1 seed. But yeah, you play a team against London, maybe last at a qualifiers. It's a different narrative behind it because Seattle was struggling, but right now they're hot and they're able to take care of business.
Yep. Seattle wins that 3-1. Vegas, Minnesota, 2 teams that were really looking to, get out of the bottom 4 or at least improve their standing so they weren't the 8 seed, maybe have a more favorable matchup in the losers bracket. Vegas comes away with this one 3-2. Not really an upset because Minnesota has been so inconsistent, kind of a seesaw like you mentioned with Seattle, but Minnesota has just not been able to reach the form that I thought they might hit, and I think a lot of people around the league thought they might hit by this point in the season. So Vegas wins this 3-2. You picked the Legion to win this match, so were you surprised by the result at all?
Nope. Vegas is winning champs, baby. Jokes aside, though, we've talked about Minnesota too extensively at this point. It's just really don't know what to expect out of them. And after this performance, they're looking at starting the major in the losers bracket right away. If they get first rounded, I feel like they got to at least discuss roster changes because it'll be after the third major now. So that's really the halfway point of the year. Will just be major 4 or 5 and champs. So. Feel like teams probably wouldn't make changes after major 4, or if they did, that would be the cutoff or the last chance. So this is one of the last opportunities if Minnesota feels like they need to make a change. And if they struggle at this major, I wouldn't be surprised to see something happen there. But we've just talked about this Minnesota squad not really knowing what to expect out of them. It definitely, in the context of their performance at Major 2, where they get third place, to see them go 0-5 in these qualifiers and struggle so mightily in search, which looked like early on to be a mode that they would be one of the better teams in the league, just is concerning, and a lot of red flags there for me. So, we've seen wild losers bracket runs at majors before. If something shakes their way in this bracket and they're able to pull something off, maybe they stick together. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at this point if we see a roster change if they struggle at Major 3.
I definitely think that it's kind of a make or break major for them. They can't afford to just spend even another maybe 3-4 weeks, even maybe another like set of qualifiers. I don't think they can afford to go through that without making some kind of change or turning it around, which I think you give them the major, you hope that maybe they're able to figure it out, win a few matches. But even then, I wouldn't be surprised if they were to get, maybe to the losers bracket round 3 and they're still not, they still make a change because they don't think that they can have this kind of team long term, because they might actually fall into the bottom 4 of the CDL standings. And then there's always like the looming threat of not making champs, which is the ultimate goal, because then anything can happen at champs. Everybody, at least in theory, is like on a level playing field. Everybody starts in the winners bracket. But yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting for Minnesota. Definitely a team to watch out for, kind of on the bad end. Some of the teams that we'll be watching out for, like Seattle or something, is like, oh, maybe they'll kind of have this breakout performance again. They'll get back to form. Whereas Minnesota, we're kind of looking at them thinking maybe you guys are done, or this roster is done as a foursome. So a very interesting major coming up for Minnesota. Not that interesting of a major for LAG or Florida, I don't imagine. These two teams have, I think, been the two worst teams, even though Minnesota is really trying to make a run for it as well. But LAG and Florida both struggled to this point in the season. LAG heading into this match this past week had not won any qualifying matches in this stage. Florida had won a kind of an upset victory over Boston, and LAG is able to win it 3-2 over the Mutineers. Any thoughts on this? Because we both did pick the Mutineers heading in.
Yeah, I would have to go back and look. This was coming off of the Gorillas losing to London in the last week, the last match of that last week, and they lost to Boston, so they're coming off an 0-2 week. Florida, on the other hand, had that win over Boston, who Boston was previously undefeated, if I remember correctly. So they lost to Seattle too after that, but that was still, a quality win for Florida. So I just think, the two bottom of the barrel teams at this point, really, and you even in the most recent episodes have been reluctant to pick either team in a match that Florida is playing against somebody that's not like a clear-cut winner. So I think this was just one, it could have gone either way, and obviously, it comes down to the wire 3-2, so it's not entirely surprising, but I would say I was a little surprised to see LAG win both searches in this. I know obviously Florida has gone through extensive changes since their previous iteration, where search was far and away their best mode, and I would have to look up the numbers of their game mode performances for this new squad, and even those would be slightly skewed because like they started getting 3-0'd by New York and Atlanta, if I remember correctly, the first two matches with this squad. So small sample size for this new Florida roster, but regardless, they're in a position now where they're going to have to fight from the losers bracket immediately a Major 3-2, which is, we talked about it with Major 2. They literally showed up, got 3-0 smoked, and they spent 30 minutes at the tournament and were just sent home after that. And people were tweeting like they got to do something about the format and stuff like that. So all that aside, I just think good on LAG taking care of business, and eventually this leads to them being able to grab a winner's bracket spot following later matches in the week. But yeah, I just think both teams have some potential, and I'm excited to see, especially this new Florida roster back on land. I just hope it's not another, very brief showing like we got last time.
Yeah, the other LA team in the league, the Los Angeles Thieves, they had the first match of Saturday against Minnesota, who we've already mentioned. And since we already also mentioned that Minnesota went 0-5 in this set of qualifiers, it's no surprise that LAT won this. They swept Minnesota. I mean, it wasn't, at least the control was not like as I'm trying to think of an analogy, but it wasn't as simple as just, another win for LAT. They actually had a pretty big comeback to win the final control and to close out the series. Since we already talked about Minnesota, any thoughts on LAT and their 3-0 victory over the RØKKR?
I think we can talk a little bit more about LAT at the end here because they played the last match on Sunday. But this is just a match, especially when you're in that position where you already had your 1-game week in these 3-game sets, and like LA Thieves is trying to grab that number 1 seed. I'm pretty sure they would have been 2-1. Entering this final weekend here, and if you're in that position, you got 2 matches the final weekend to try and get the best seed possible. And especially first match, you're going up a struggling team that's winless. You just got to come out and take care of business. And that's exactly what they were able to do, especially in that position. 3-1 is much better than 2-2, regardless of who you're playing in your final matchup. It just almost makes it guaranteed that you're going to be in the winner's bracket, just because usually that 2 and 3 is where the tiebreaker cutoff is for the top 8. Or the 8th and final spot for winner's bracket. So, they came out, got the job done, and kind of made sure that they weren't in a position to start in the loser's bracket, which, early in those qualifiers for Major 2 looked like a very real possibility for them.
Back to LAG, a lot of LA talk so far in this pod, but LAG played the next match against Vegas in what would be one of the more crucial matches in terms of seeding and the winner's bracket in general. LAG, they entered the match with a 1-3 record. Vegas was at 2-2, but both of them really needed a win. LAG needed a win just to even have a shot because they weren't going to get in with a 1-4 record. Vegas would have essentially guaranteed themselves a spot in the winner's bracket with a 3-2 record. Unfortunately, Vegas might be winning champs, but they didn't win this match. A 3-1 victory for the Gorillas. Let's just talk about this real quick because I think Vegas is just a weird team in general. They're very inconsistent. Well, I guess they're very consistent in losing respawns. So what did you think of their loss against LAG?
I think it's a heartbreaker, man, especially just because they especially had been looking good in search. In their most recent match against Minnesota, again, Minnesota's been struggling, but they win 2 searches there, and then they're able to take that map 1 hard point in this series against LAG. So if they're able to continue that search and destroy performance, you're looking at a 2-0 lead, and that's obviously a good position to be in outside of getting reverse swept. So they had their fate in their own hands. I'm pretty sure I saw stuff that it might have been the first time that the Vegas franchise would have been starting a major and winners bracket, and I don't know if that counts Paris or not, but obviously I know they had that one run in MW 2019 where they got like second in a home series, but obviously the home series format was a little different.
Yeah, I don't think there's a winner's bracket.
Yeah, than these majors. So if that's the case, that's just a wild stat. But regardless, they had every opportunity here to make it happen, and it just they fell short, which just seems to be a mantra for the Vegas/Paris franchise as a whole. So they're going to be starting in the losers bracket again, and like I was just saying for the last LAG match, they came out, took care of business, won 2 matches to give themselves the best chance to get into the winners bracket, and they squeaked in with that 8 seed. So no matter what, they get to at least play 2 series at this major, which for a team with especially in my eyes, like a young up-and-comer like Joe Deceives. I know obviously Assault and Exceed have some pro experience, Assault more than Exceed, but especially Jodeci's getting more reps on land for him can only help him improve in my eyes. So I think that's obviously a better outcome than them starting in losers bracket for them and everything going on behind the scenes with uh, the layoffs and talk of franchise being sold and all that yada yada. Um, it was probably good for a positive for the LAGs there. So I feel like I was gonna say something else, but I can't really think of it.
I was just looking at their results, the Legion franchise, even dating back to when they were Paris and since 2019, and I don't believe they've ever been in the winners bracket. Obviously, this season, 9th in the qualifiers, 10th in the qualifiers, 12th in the qualifiers, and even when they were in Paris, they finished 12th, 12th, 10th, and 12th. So, like, I mean, obviously it's not a surprise if you look at last season because they had the worst season in CDL history. You know, they won a handful of matches. Not a big surprise that they wouldn't have made the winners bracket. But even looking at the Cold War season, I don't see them anywhere above 7th. I guess stage 4, they finished 7-8, which I have to now. I don't know how the majors worked. My brain isn't working, that far back, but I don't believe that they made it. So, I mean, I think that stat's probably correct that they, as an organization, have never been in the winners bracket of a major. Although, like you mentioned, they did have that one home series event in MW where they finished, I believe, second, losing to Dallas. But it's been 2.5, 3, almost 3 years since that's happened. So yeah, it's been a really rough stretch for the Legion franchise.
I remember the only other thing I was going to bring up there was that weird round in this one where Two Real got those
Oh yeah,
pretty suspect wall bangs. Um, but I didn't get to see after that if there was any like drama or anything behind that. But I thought that was kind of funny.
yeah, it did look like hacking. Like if he was a random, I think some people would report him for it. But he's a pro, so you hope that there's nothing, and there probably is nothing. Toronto versus London. I mean, I don't even know. I'm getting really tired of London. They're so annoying with this crap. But like of course we picked against London because why wouldn't you? They're going against the Ultra. Ultra are one of the better teams. At least like top half in the league right now. And of course Toronto loses it. London wins 3-2. In one of the bigger upsets this weekend. Any thoughts on this match?
Definitely a surprising one. I think you give me this match 10 times out of 10, I'm picking Toronto here. So, um, yeah, I think it really only just because of London's positions in the standings, like it doesn't mean much for them outside of not coming in last or going winless. I would have to look at the standings. I don't remember. I think they beat somebody else anyway. Um, but regardless, I think it's a bigger loss for Toronto than a win for London, just in the sense of Toronto looked like they had been playing well since inserting Hicksy into the lineup, and now they head into this major, possibly not looking as strong as they had been, just because they're heading in with a loss. So I am just in general interested to see how the new Hicksy lineup will perform on LAN, and they should be tested right out of the gate at Major 3, so I'm excited about that.
Final match of Saturday was really important for a lot of fans. We've mentioned many times that OpTic Texas has the largest fan base in the league. And going into the final match of Saturday against the New York Subliners, OpTic were kind of on bubble watch since we're in March. We're thinking about the bracket, but if they lost both of their final matches of the week, they would not make the winners bracket at the major. And of course, that's even more notable because OpTic is hosting this next major. They won it last year when they were in Arlington. So if OpTic had dropped this match and their match on Sunday, they would not make the winners bracket. And they did not win this match. They get swept by New York 3-0. like a pretty tough series. Like as a whole, it was a 51 point hard point, and then a round 11 S&D and a round 5 control. So not a big result, not a wide result, but still a 3-0. OpTic, really in danger of missing out on the winner's bracket of their own major. Any thoughts on New York's victory?
I thought, it was a solid win for New York. Obviously, 51 point hard point win, around 11 in the search, and around 5 control. So it's not like it was exactly a 3-0 blowout, but regardless, New York came out and took care of business here. I feel like I'm saying that a lot, but yeah, like you said, at least after this match, it was definitely scary thoughts going through the head of OpTic, doubters, thinking about all the worst case scenarios, because going into Sunday, playing FaZe, reigning champs, all that stuff. And yeah, starting if OpTic started their own major in the losers bracket, that would just be a massive storyline. So, big win for New York here, and obviously a very concerning loss for OpTic fans at the time.
Yeah, it wasn't even really a surprising result like you kind of alluded to, because New York has been one of the best teams all season long. OpTic is still, seemingly getting used to this new roster with Ghosty and without Illy in the lineup. So it seems to be kind of an adjustment period for OpTic, and New York's just been very good. So not a surprise at all. But then you get to the next day, first match of Sunday, March 5th, and Seattle and New York go at it. Again, New York, there's a rematch of the Major 1 Grand Finals. Seattle, since that point, essentially has been on like a downward slide. New York has actually stayed steady over the past several months since Major 1. And of course, Seattle comes out on top, because why wouldn't they? They're the ultimate roller coaster. You get a real down period. It starts to go down really fast, you get a little scared, and then it starts to go up a little bit, and we're just waiting for it to go down again. But at this point in time, Seattle 3-0's New York, and they head into the major with a much needed win, a lot of confidence, I'm sure, flowing through the Seattle camp. What do you think of this? Because you did predict it correctly, but I still think it's pure luck that you picked Seattle and not New York.
No, I mean, my reasoning was that I just had a gut feeling for it last time, but I mean, that's my point in that last podcast it's been a matchup, regardless of result, that's been extremely close. And we've seen it multiple times at this point now. Like it was in that when it would have been in the winners bracket at Major 1, where like Hydra had that controller issue or whatever, and Seattle was able to win that series, but then New York gets revenge in the grand finals. I can't remember when else we saw it, but it was just a matchup that I think they played maybe in the qualifiers last set too, but I don't know exactly the schedule. So,
Yeah.
regardless, it's a matchup we've seen a couple times now this season, and something was telling me it was going to go Seattle's way. And like I said for their earlier match, they're hot right now, and I think. I would definitely, after New York 3-0's OpTic, you're thinking like, okay, this is probably not going to be that easy for Seattle, even if they do get a win. But for Seattle to get a 3-0 over New York after New York 3-0's Boston, I think that's pretty impressive, and that just speaks to how strong Seattle look at this current time.
Yeah, just a really weird season, a weird team in general. They do this quite often, and I guess it's good. Like they're peaking at the right time. You hope that they can peak again near the end of the season, but it was getting to a point, this downward slide that they were on for Seattle. It did seem to be like, okay, what is the future of this roster? There were people that were saying replace accuracy. Oh, they should have taken the deal with OpTic for Pred, blah, blah, blah. But now that they're now the number 1 seed heading into the major, and they were able to beat New York, who I think is a top 3 team in the league. I mean, it's got to feel good for the Surge team, the general manager, the coaches, that they stuck by each other. They weren't making any roster change. We even had Sib and Pred, I believe, make like public like displays of admiration and a lot of respect for accuracy, saying like he's helped us a lot. He's a really good teammate. Blah blah blah. So I think Seattle it's a cool story that they're able to kind of patch together what has been a rough season since that first major. Next up, Atlanta versus OpTic. Biggest match of the week by far, just based on all of the circumstances around it, mostly with OpTic. Atlanta had already guaranteed a spot in the winners bracket. They were 3-1 heading into this match, and OpTic heading in were definitely not safe at all, not feeling comfortable at all. They needed to win this match to even get into the winners bracket. A loss would guarantee that they would start in the losers bracket, which is not like necessarily a death sentence for the CDL teams. We saw, I think, LAT last major had a very long extended run in the losers bracket, but even then I believe they started in the winners bracket, so they even had that little buffer where they were able to lose one match and then recover and go on for a few rounds. If you start in the losers bracket, it's very, very difficult to fight all the way without making one mistake, without losing one match. And it's just not something you want to do. So OpTic going into this needed to win to beat Atlanta FaZe to get into the winners bracket, and they actually did that. OpTic with the entire green wall looking at it, ready to blame Ghosty, ready to blame Dashy, ready to blame whoever was going to get blamed and become the scapegoat of the green wall if they lost and had to start in the losers bracket. All of that went out the window. OpTic beats Atlanta 3-1. What are your thoughts on this? Because OpTic and Atlanta have had kind of a more even rivalry over the past, at least this season. I think even part of last season, OpTic seemed to get the better of Atlanta more than they did when FaZe was on that incredible run during Cold War. So what did you think of this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we set the stage here. It was a must-win match for OpTic, and they came out and somehow were able to beat the reigning major champs. So kudos to them. Obviously, totally different story if they're playing like London or one of the bottom of the standing teams here, but to have a must-win match against one of, if not the best teams in the league, that speaks volumes to the potential of this OpTic team in my eyes. I think notably, though, Atlanta continues their search streak, which is going to be very important to their success at this following major. But once again, they dropped 2 hard points here, which kind of was similar to their situation heading into Major 2. They were seemingly dropping a lot of hard points, and they were able to piece it together enough at Major 2 that combined with their flawless search that got them to the championship. So obviously we'll talk about their incredibly tough first round matchup once we get there, but if Atlanta wants to defend their title, I'm definitely going to have my eyes on their hardpoint performance in conjunction with keeping up their flawless search.
Speaking of that hard point, the first one, aBeZy dropped 41 kills in that. He had 69 nice engagements and just an incredible, but on the flip side, Slasher, 18 kills, 29 deaths. He had a 0.62 KD in the opening hard point. They ended up losing that by 3 seconds. Just really, really crazy that they were that close, even with Slasher having a bad game, because aBeZy did so well. Salim even had 31. Simp almost dropped 30 as well. A really crazy hard point to start off that series. And I fully agree with you as far as the search and destroy. That's a really major key. We even saw it last season with LAG when they had that incredible run in Major 2. They weren't anything special heading into that. Even through their first match where they got knocked into the losers bracket, not a lot of people were thinking very highly of them, but then they kept winning search. They were able to cobble together some of the other respawns, and that was recipe for success. They were able to win a championship. FaZe hasn't been perfect in the respawns, but they've been better than average, and they've been excellent in search and destroy, which we've seen in the past is something that can happen. It's something that can lead you to success. And FaZe, if they're able to win some of these respawns and not, like in this series, they dropped all 3 respawns, which is obviously something that you can't do even logically, but that is going to be a tough thing if they struggle in respawns at all. But I really look forward to their their run at the major, see how this S&D streak holds up, or if it gets broken by a certain team. Final match of the weekend: Boston versus LAT. Not a whole lot to play for these two teams because heading in, I believe Boston had been they're in the winners bracket, if I'm not mistaken, right?
So it was, if LA Thieves won this match, they got the first seed. If Boston won this match, they got the second seed.
Yeah.
So it was really, they were both in winners bracket. It was just a question of seeding.
Yeah. So, not a ton to play for. We've seen some of these later qualifying matches with two teams that I've either already been in the winners bracket or even in the losers bracket. Some people are like, oh, will they throw it, to kind of get a more favorable seeding? And I think there was some, at least for LAT, in my opinion, actually for both of these teams, it was kind of like, if we lose this game, who do we play? LAT, if they lose, they play Atlanta, which is not a fun matchup for anybody. Boston, if they win, they play OpTic, which is exactly what happens. Boston wins this 3-2, an upset, at least in our eyes, just because, I wasn't expecting Boston to kind of be this solid, especially after the roster change with replacing methods. But they win 3-2. LAT, they get bumped down to the 5th seed, and now they have to play the 4th seed, which is FaZe. Boston secures that 2nd seed, like you mentioned, and they will now have to play OpTic, the 7th seed. Any thoughts on this before we get into, officially previewing the major?
Yeah, I thought it was a little surprising, kind of like you said, but I am just in general excited to see the ramifications of this play out. Like you said, I'm super excited for that first round matchup between FaZe and LAT, and I'm also excited to see how Beans and this new Boston squad perform on LAN for the first time. Obviously, we did see Beans briefly play, but that was with methods and in place of Awakening at Major 1 because Awakening got sick. But regardless of that, it will be interesting because although they got the 2nd seed, they have to play the 7 seed OpTic at their home major. So crowd's going to be against them. Even when Boston played OpTic in Boston, the crowd was still, I wouldn't say heavily in favor of OpTic, but you could tell it was there were their Boston fans, but there were definitely OpTic fans there. It wasn't like I would expect to see at this, where it's going to be 90% OpTic fans in the crowd for OpTic versus Boston. But regardless, I'm excited to see how Beans performed. I think I keep thinking of that one map where he struggled against Toronto and the team still won. In his very first series of these qualifiers. I feel like he's turned it around completely since then, and he's been performing very well. So I'm excited to see how he plays. And I think this sets the stage. We saw in your eyes, 3 upsets on Sunday, but I think you can't really argue that Seattle over New York is an upset regardless of recent performances. So I think that sets the stage for this major. We even talked about it last major. That first round of winners bracket felt like it was going to be a lot of chalk, but I mean, upsets are inevitable at this point, and with the most recent sample, you can say it's online COD, but or you can even blame MW2. But regardless, I think I can look at these matchups and see who I think is going to win, and I can already tell I'm definitely going to get at least one of them wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I went 3-7 this week. You went 5-5, and that was mostly because these teams were just able to pull something out. Maybe it was some of these teams didn't have as much to play for, which even subconsciously could help. But some like OpTic had to play their best to beat FaZe. One of the best teams, if not the best. OpTic had to win that match. They had something to play for. Boston, playing just really well. I think a lot of times some of these teams that, necessarily don't have anything to play for, or like the seeding isn't as important as you might think. But Boston winning that over LAT is like a massive boost of confidence, right? Like you have to think going into the major, you've now beat LAT, who were just in the major finals last time around. They're one of the better teams, defending world champions. Like, that's a great win for them. Even LAG, like, to be able to get into winner's bracket, which I think might be the craziest part about the seeding heading into Major 3, is that LAG, who I considered probably the worst team, maybe the second worst team if Florida is, like, doing their thing. The fact that LAG were able to get in the winners bracket, I think, is just ridiculous. They, even at 2 and 3, like, I didn't think they'd be able to win 2 matches. Like, that takes some level of consistency. So there's a lot to be excited for, a lot to be kind of interested in as we head into this third major. What sticks out to you when you're looking at the major just right off the bat? Like, is there any match, any team that you're looking at and you're like, man, that's going to be really interesting?
Right away, the first match that comes to my eyes is FaZe versus Thieves. I was talking when I talked to the FaZe guys after Major 2, and they kind of said how nice it felt for them to get a little bit of revenge over the Thieves after they lost to them to end the season twice at both of the final 2 Vanguard events. And I was thinking, like, I looked at the schedule and I saw they were playing a qualifier match in this set of online matches, and I was like, this is a match we could see multiple times throughout the rest of the year. And now we just saw it in the qualifiers. We're seeing it again right off the bat here. And I think this just has massive implications for the tournament as a whole, because whoever loses this one immediately goes down and could potentially get top 12 if they come in slacking against whoever they fall down to in the losers bracket. At the same time here, you expect Surge to beat LAG, but I think Surge versus FaZe/LAT, whoever wins that second matchup versus Surge, that could be the match that determines who makes it to the finals from the winners bracket, just because the way Surge is playing and the strength of FaZe and Thieves overall, like, that should just be an incredibly strong match that could set the stage for the entire rest of the tournament.
LAT FaZe, I fully agree with you, is just a ridiculously great matchup to start in winners bracket. We've seen it before where, FaZe versus OpTic or OpTic versus LAT, some kind of a combination of those 3 teams playing each other right off the bat is always exciting, because one of these teams has to go down to the losers bracket. Like, there's no way out of that, and there's a very real chance that FaZe or Thieves, I don't think it would happen, because I would probably pick FaZe or Thieves against any of the losers bracket teams, but there's always the chance that one of these teams will go home without a win and get upset in the losers bracket, which is crazy to think about, because I think, they just went to the grand finals of the previous major, and there's a very real chance that one of these teams will go home without a single win, which would be a really shocking thing to happen. I pulled up the stats real quick for FaZe and LAT head-to-head so far this season. They played 3 times, 2 online. So like you mentioned, they played earlier in this qualifier set. They also played in the first set of qualifiers, and they played in the grand finals of the second major in a best of 7 series. So the head-to-head map record, 1-5 in hard point for Atlanta FaZe, so 5-1 in favor of Thieves, 4-1 in search and destroy in favor of Atlanta FaZe, and 3-1 in control in favor of Atlanta FaZe. I think, I'm pretty sure S&D will be something that FaZe probably gets the edge in. Maybe they won't be as dominant if they have to play LAT over and over again, because I feel like LAT is such a good team, have such a good coaching staff, that they're going to be able to steal a search and destroy away from them eventually. But, if you play them 100 times, I think FaZe is probably going to win most of the search and destroys. At least from what we've seen so far, LAT is the better hardpoint team, or a more consistent hardpoint team at this point in the season. So I would probably go with LAT, which then it brings it back to control, which we've said many times, the least important game mode, simply because of the numbers of a series. But that third game mode is the swing game mode. It's the swing map. It can really set the tone of a series. And that will probably be what it comes down to between these two teams on a more general basis. Of course, there might be some differences series to series, but a really interesting matchup, at least on paper and in actuality, because we saw a really good grand finals between them that went 6 games out of the 7 at Major 2. If you had to pick, and let's pick, because we will give our predictions for the winners bracket matches, and then we'll message each other during the course of the major to kind of figure out the predictions for each of these. But who would you pick out of FaZe and Thieves now that we're just talking about it in the winners bracket?
I gotta go with Atlanta just because recency. We saw it on land the last time they played, despite the online results. But it's definitely a concern if I see it going 3-2 Atlanta or 3-1 Thieves, where Thieves take the respawns. So Atlanta just has to, in my eyes, find a way to win one of those respawns, either map 1, 3, or 4, then take both searches, and that should be their path to victory.
I think that's a good pick. I typically like to go with the teams that have the momentum. They have some kind of little charge behind them to heading to the major, but both of these teams are coming in off of a loss. You had FaZe losing to OpTic on the last day, and you had LAT losing to Boston on the last day. So there isn't a momentum factor for either of these teams, in my opinion. But then then I kind of revert back to how have these two teams matched up during the season. And what I just read off to you, the fact that FaZe has been very lackluster and hard point against the Thieves, but have had the edge in search and destroy and control. That makes me feel a little more comfortable going with FaZe, and probably going with FaZe 3-2 if I had to guess, just because they haven't been able to find that consistency in hardpoint. And that just makes me think that Thieves might be able to take like 1-4. And then, like you said, FaZe has to clutch up both of those searches and then find a way to win one of the respawns, probably the control if I had to guess. So I would go with FaZe 3-2, but that's definitely the matchup that I'm most looking forward to heading into the winners bracket. Just an incredible, meeting to start off the major. What do you think about this Surge Gorillas matchup? Because you did briefly speak about it, because that would seem to be, depending on what kind of Surge or what kind of Gorillas show up, that could be like an easier semifinals matchup for FaZe or Thieves. So who do you have between Seattle and LAG?
I feel like I gotta go with Seattle. I picked them in both of their last matchups here in this most recent qualifying matchup, and kind of hype them up a little bit as playing well. So if I pick LAG here now, and I just can't really justify it. So I think this should be, at least in my eyes, it probably is the most lopsided semifinal or not semifinal, winners round 1 match. I could see OpTic versus Breach also being, one-sided depending on the crowd factor. But not taking that into consideration, it's the 1 seed versus the 8 seed, so it's not really that ludicrous of a statement to expect Surge to, take care of business against the Gorillas.
The weird thing about this matchup between Seattle and LAG is that they haven't played since the very first match of the season. Seattle's first match of the year was a 3-2 loss against LAG, but that Gorillas roster is not the same at all other than Arcides, and Seattle is in a different place seemingly now than they were at the beginning of the season, because if you remember in the qualifiers before the first major of the season, they weren't doing well at all. They were 1-3 in those qualifiers, and then they turned it on once they got to the major, ended up getting second place. I agree with you. I think Seattle wins this because I just can't pick LAG it's against my conscience at this point. I have some LAG merch, but I'm not gonna ride or die for them at this point. It's just too hard of a matchup for them, especially if Seattle is gonna be able to keep up this form, because they have won 4 of their last 5 matches, with their only loss being to LAT in the online qualifiers. But there's also the chance, and I think that it can't be taken lightly, that Seattle goes into this major, a lot of confidence, and then immediately get upset, and then things start to go down again, and they have another slump. It's something that's happened a lot. I could see it happening at any point for them. But yeah, if I had to pick, I would go Seattle.
Did you give an actual pick for FaZe LAT?
I went with FaZe.
Okay.
You talked about the OpTic Boston match. I think it's a very interesting matchup because Boston has overperformed to this point, and OpTic, I don't think they've over or underperformed. I think they've performed exactly how I would expect them. They've had some kind of disappointment. They're not as good as the fans think they should be, which they never will be. But they're definitely not as bad as the haters would like them to be. And they're kind of like sneaking into the upper echelon of teams. I think they're going to get used to each other relatively soon. That being said, Boston's played really well heading into this major, and that gives me a little pause about like whether OpTic can right out of the gate beat Boston. But I do think that with that home factor of having, hundreds of OpTic fans, it's going to be, almost 100% OpTic supporters in this major, at least in this match. Maybe when they go up against LAT or go up against FaZe, it might be a little bit different. But at this point in Arlington, in an OpTic owned or Envy, whatever they call it, their owned arena, I just don't think that Boston can overcome that, at least right out of the gate. So I'm going to go with OpTic. I'll say 3-1. Let's just say Boston gets the search because that's a true OpTic series.
Yeah, I think I'm going with OpTic here too. Just think the crowd is going to play too much of a factor. Boston could obviously prove us wrong. They played well in these online qualifiers, but I'm just going to have to see it too, it play out to actually want to pick it. And I just that's telling me OpTic. I'm going with them.
Toronto and Subliners, the final match of the winners bracket. I just can't pick Toronto at this point. It's too risky. They're a good team, definitely. I think the Hixie move has been a little more positive than I thought it would be, at least immediately. I wasn't expecting them to fall off a cliff, but I was expecting there to be a few more issues for Toronto, and they've been relatively good even with it. They've been surprisingly steady despite the change. I don't think it's made them get much better or much worse, but I still can't pick them against New York. New York is a top 3 team, one of the best in the game right now. Even with that that loss to Seattle, I don't know whether that's indicative of New York or Seattle, to be honest with you, because the Surge have been capable of winning against anybody. They can beat anybody on any given day. They're that good of a team. They've proven it over the past year and a half. So I'm not going to hold that against New York, especially since it is an online match. But yeah, so I'm going to go with New York on this against Toronto. What do you think?
Yeah, I got to go with New York too. I think the scariest thing, at least for Toronto and Toronto fans, is that just thinking back to that last major, they lost that. They looked good in their first match. Then they have the Saturday where they lose their first match in the winners bracket, and then they lose the following match in the losers bracket 3-0, 3-0. They're done 0-6 Saturday out of the major. So if they do end up dropping this first match here to New York, it'd be interesting to me to see, a little bit of a different situation. Whereas they had already won a match in the winners bracket, so they dropped down to face, I can't remember. I think it was the Thieves. So it's a little bit different dropping down later in the losers bracket as opposed to dropping down and playing one of those bottom 4 teams guaranteed. But if Toronto does lose this match, my eyes are going to be on if they're able to bounce back, or if it's another case where they just, lose 2 consecutive matches on land.
With this third major, we have 5 majors total this season. So we're over the halfway point in the year. but this does feel kind of like a halfway point, sort of like the fact that we don't have an even number of majors, so that kind of hurts. But I think this is going to be the time when teams make changes that they hope can last through champs or through Major 5 into champs, hopefully qualifying. What teams stick out to you? We've talked about Minnesota. Are there any other teams at the major that you think, if something doesn't go right, something they don't perform up to standard, do you think our roster changes are coming? Which teams, if any, other than Minnesota, do you think that happens for?
I think we're in a lot of weird situations with some of these teams, right? Like LAG, we don't know what's going on with ownership. So like if they get top 12, I'm not really sure if they would make any more moves. Maybe just because they have like Spart and Neptune still on contract, maybe they would make a switch somehow like that, but that would be weird too. So I don't really know. And then even like London, I don't feel like they're going to spend more money. Florida, I feel like they're going to try to ride it out with this squad and just see what they're able to make happen, but who knows there. We've talked about Vegas's money situation in the past, so I don't know if they're making any other changes, so it's really tough. I think Minnesota is just the one that sticks out to me. Maybe if New York somehow struggle, they make a change, but even that would be weird. That's kind of like just saying it to say something.
Yeah. I mean, I think of London as a possible change. They have not been hesitant to change rosters like some of these other teams, Legion being one of them, where, we know they're just not going to spend any money. They don't want to really do a whole lot as far as supporting their team's rosters with like an acquisition. London, I feel, is a little bit different. There are some things that they probably could do, maybe a challengers player, maybe more English players to kind of round out this, like, to make it more of an all English roster, or to kind of bring it back to it being a like an English roster, because right now we have Nasty, Asum, Scraps, and Paul X on this roster. Zero got benched earlier in the season. For Scraps, I believe there was another roster change, if I'm not mistaken, at some point. Not maybe not, but this roster just feels weird. They're the worst team in the league, so far this season. They are 4-12 on the season, have 40 CDL points through this to this point, and they're in the losers bracket. Obviously, starting in the losers bracket, they're going to have to play one of these teams. I don't remember how the losers bracket stuff works. If they end up facing like Boston or OpTic, I'm not entirely sure, but it's going to be a really tough way anyway. Even if they played like LAG, I don't think that they would have a great shot at getting out of losers bracket round 1, which, now that I think about it, I'm looking at Kagamepedia. It does look like London would play the loser of Boston and OpTic, and that's, neither of those matchups are too appealing. Boston's been playing really well, and OpTic, just the talent level was kind of ridiculous to be in the losers bracket. So, like, what do you think of London? Do you think there's a chance that this team will make a roster change? They would only have 4 wins heading into the 4th set of qualifiers.
I guess of those bottom teams, it does they haven't been as reluctant as some of these other organizations to make changes, so I wouldn't be surprised if they did. But I just think at their current position, they might just be like, chalk up the season from a monetary standpoint and just try to make something happen with the squad they currently have. I don't know. I do think it is worth mentioning we are talking about London, and they just came off that impressive win over Toronto, so things could be turning around for them. Obviously, that's just one online match, but if they are able to beat whoever drops down to face them, that'd be a pretty big upset, and it could be the turnaround that the franchise is looking for.
I also think, you mentioned a little bit with LAG, but it's probably something that every team is a little bit cognizant of at this point in the season. What is the financial state of the league? What is the financial state of these teams? Are these teams going to be willing to spend the money required to build a competitive roster at this point in the season. Minnesota, like they probably put a lot of money into this roster, don't you think? Like with Afro coming in from London, Attach was an unrestricted free agent in the offseason, and then you had the guys coming in from Toronto. Like the idea of that is they probably spent a lot of money and they have to be very disappointed in the results so far. Are they willing to use that money or use even more money to kind of pour it into the CDL roster, or are they gonna take more of a backseat role and be okay with the results, or put in a substitute and try to figure that out? I think that has to be mentioned at least for some of these teams. Maybe for all of these teams, maybe they don't want to. They just saw LAG essentially pull out of the league reportedly, or one of the owners pull out of the league, and I think that has to be kind of on some of their minds, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, definitely one of those situations where it's just like, based on the like you mentioned, state of the league, state of some of these teams, and even the point in the season we're at. You really just have to evaluate where you are. I don't even have.
I'll pull up the standings real quick, just so we have a point of reference. Right now, the top 8 teams in the league: Atlanta at 1, New York at 2, Toronto at 3, LAT at 4, OpTic at 5, Boston 6, Seattle 7, and Minnesota are currently 8th. The bottom 4 of the league: LAG at 9, Vegas at 10, Florida at 11, London at 12. There could be some tiebreaker stuff, so I'm looking at it right now, and Boston, Seattle, and Minnesota are technically tied for 6th. I don't know what kind of tiebreakers they are. So, like, they are all tied for 6th at this point in the season, and LAG and Vegas are tied for 9th. That does not, I guess, like, Minnesota being in the top 8 could make them feel a little more comfortable with, like, the long-term future of this roster, because there is kind of a relatively sizable gap between themselves and LAG and Vegas. They have a 40-point edge on 9th place, which is, it's almost, it's an even bigger gap than Atlanta has over NYSL right now. So, what do you think about that? Does that change your opinion, or what does that make you think about, how some of these teams will react to this upcoming major?
If anything, that kind of just reasserts my feeling that Minnesota is going to be the one team to try to make a move if they struggle here, because I feel like for Minnesota, it was kind of a disappointing result that last year, I believe, did they miss champs last year?
They got knocked out, I think, at the last major.
So I think that was disappointing for them, and they won't want a repeat of that. So if they're in that position where they're on the fringe of not making it again, I feel like Minnesota would be a little bit aggressive and doing whatever the team feels is necessary to try to push them over the edge. And I don't know what the change would be. I don't know what change I would make to Minnesota. But that just feels like the one team, especially just based on recent performances, and even when they were playing well at the last major. Heading in with those qualifiers, you and I were both saying we really didn't know what to make of this team and their performance. So it just seems like they might do something to try and, push a jolt into the squad and reinvigorate the squad at a pivotal point in the season.
I'm looking at Seattle and I'm thinking, what is going to happen with this team? Because before this set of qualifiers, there was a lot of buzz, deserved or not, that they would make a roster change, or that they should make a roster change rather, because they had such a bad second part of the season. Now they're in a place they're tied with for 6th in the league. They have the number 1 seed heading into the major. They have a history of when they are doing well, they keep doing well until like everything goes off the rails. But in the midst of a winning streak, they just seem to keep winning, and that's been a trend for them. Do you foresee any kind of roster change for Seattle in the next month?
If they didn't make a change earlier when there was reportedly a large offer for Pred, I don't think they're going to. Maybe if they somehow get top 12 at this major, they make a change. But I think if they perform well at this major, then I definitely don't see them making a change. But I don't, and it's weird, right? Because like we already talked about it earlier in the show, where like you would think the position they try to upgrade at is accuracy. We even talked about that in the off season. But then you were just bringing up how Sib and Pred were coming to accuracy's defense. So it's like, do they really want to make a change there, even if that's like the area that they could potentially make a change in? I don't see Seattle doing anything. I would be surprised.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that they make a change. Maybe if they got double first rounded at this major because they had the number 1 seed, and it would just be a pretty catastrophic failure to go out like that. But I have really high expectations for them at this major because they're on this win streak. That makes me a lot more confident in them. You never know when that goes off the rails and they just aren't the same team anymore. But at this point in time, like, I have to kind of ride with them, have to have some pretty high expectations for them. Let's get some definitive answers. Who do you think wins the 3rd major of this Call of Duty League season?
I think whoever wins the FaZe Thieves opening round matchup is going to be the eventual winner of the tournament. I think I have to go with FaZe. I was willing to pick them last major, so I gotta stick with them here. If I wasn't gonna go with someone from that match as a cop out, I was going to say I'll pick the Surge. They won Major 3 last year. And they're just looking really strong recently, which sets me up to completely look like an idiot if they struggle here. But nonetheless, so I'm going with FaZe as my locked in answer. If I wasn't allowed to pick FaZe for whatever reason, or say like the winner of FaZe versus LAT first round, I would go with Surge.
You don't have to look like an idiot because I would do it for you. I think the Seattle Surge are going to win this major.
No way.
I am fully I fully believe that when this team decides that it wants to win, they just do it. There's not a whole lot stopping them. I'm looking at their kind of history as an organization. So this is,
you don't have to really look before last year.
No, but even in 2021, at the end of 2021, they went to LAN, if you remember. That was
FaZe.
Yeah, so that was the first time like we did pretty much the entire 2020 season online, and that team stunk. 2021, for the most part, the season was online, and during that season when they were online, Seattle stunk. And then they went to Stage 5 Major, which I believe was in Dallas, so maybe a good luck charm, I don't know. Stage 5 Major, they started in the losers bracket, and they won 3 straight matches, including a Game 5 victory over FaZe, who ended up winning the World Championship. Seattle did not qualify for the World Championship after losing to OpTic in the Stage 5 Major. Then they start off in the kickoff last year. They win 3, then lose 1. They win 3 to start the season, and then lose 5 in a row. They have like a few, they beat FaZe, and then they lose 2. They win 2 more, beating LAT and OpTic, which of course they did. And then they lose 6 straight matches. And then they get to Major 3, the qualifiers. They start a, believe, 9-match win streak, which includes winning Major 3. Coincidentally, we are at Major 3 now. Then they lose 5 in a row. They lose 6 of their next 7. I believe like 8 of their next 11. And then they go on another win streak starting at Major 1 after having a rough first set of qualifiers. They win, I believe this is, so they win 3 matches to start major one, and then they lose in the grand finals to New York, which has kind of set off all of these events, like what we're talking about. You had the Pred stuff happening earlier in the season. Is he going to go to OpTic? Is Seattle going to accept this massive buyout from OpTic? It doesn't happen. That pretty much leads to them completely falling off a cliff for the next month and a half. Since then, or after that, they lost 6 of their next 8 matches. But since then, they've won 3 matches in a row, beating Florida, London, not great, but then sweeping New York. This makes me think we're in like the upswing for Seattle. This is the time to buy. Like, Seattle stock is not at its lowest, but it's like still not very high. It's time to buy in right now, and then we'll sell it off after they win the major. We'll cash out. Everything will be good. So I am going to go with Seattle. That's what my heart wants to tell me. My brain probably says like LAT or something like that, but I'm not feeling too confident. Maybe, it's either FaZe or LAT. That's what the brain says, but the brain's stupid anyway. It doesn't matter. I got to go with Seattle. I just think with everything that's happened, I think this is the perfect time for them to, kind of complete this almost like a full circle mid-season, to have such high highs and such low lows. So I'm going to go with Seattle to win the 3rd major.
I just want the record to show that I when I said no way to Preston picking Seattle, it wasn't to the notion of Seattle being picked. It was the fact that Preston was actually picking Seattle. Especially after recent matches where he didn't seem to have a lot of faith. It seems he is fully on that bandwagon, which could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. If
that's a bad thing for them.
Major 2, where he picked Toronto, and Toronto, as we already mentioned earlier, had that 06 map count on Saturday. So I guess we'll just see what happens. I think once again, it might be a little repetitive, but just the nature of the CDL and its current form is there's so much variance and so many different things that could happen at this tournament. It should be an absolute banger.
It's not a good thing for Seattle when I pick them. They almost never win when I pick them. They almost always win when I pick against them. So take that as you will. Same with London, though, and I don't think they'll win the major, so I fully expect to come back next week and be talking about how London had this greatest run of all time to win the 3rd major and to maybe they're world championship contenders. I fully expect that, but I really do think Seattle has a great chance to do this. Better than they probably did at the first major, definitely better than they did second major because they were in the losers bracket. But it's going to be tough. Like that semifinals match, I fully expect them to beat LAG. But then when you get to FaZe or LAT in the semifinals, possibly a rematch against New York in the finals, the winners finals, it's not an easy bracket whatsoever, but that just speaks to what you just said. There's a lot of parity in the league, whether that's, Activision induced, Infinity Ward induced parity, or whether that's just having so many talented players, only having 12 teams where the talent pool has kind of kept growing, the talent level has kept rising, but the teams stayed the same. Who knows? But really interesting major. Any other thoughts before we wrap up the show? Any other thoughts on the 3rd major of the CDL season?
Nope. I think we hit most of the major talking points. I think we have some really good winners round matchups. It will be interesting to see those teams that lose in the winners round, how they stack up against these bottom teams, because I feel like last time I don't think we saw any of the bottom teams win at major 2. I feel like maybe they have a slightly better chance here, but that's just because I think Florida has a little bit more potential. London's coming off that win over Toronto. So I think it's very possible for winners bracket teams to just drop down and immediately beat those bottom 4 teams. But even Minnesota came in 3rd at the last major. They struggle in these online qualifiers, but LAN is a different beast. So maybe they just completely turn things around when they're on LAN. Who knows? But yeah, I think we really hit everything here. I'm excited to see how everything plays out because as excited as I am for some of these particular matches, I just think we should see a lot of exciting ones regardless of who's playing.
Yeah, definitely a very exciting time in the CDL, even with all of the stuff we've talked about over the past few weeks, kind of how turbulent things are behind the scenes. But the games has been as good as ever. The teams are as good as ever. The players, I mean, it's just ridiculous how much talent's in the league. And the third major, I think, is shaping up to be the most exciting, the most intriguing one. And we've had some majors already this year where we both admittedly went into it saying we don't have any idea who's going to come out on top. I think we're in the same boat now with some of these late qualifier upsets. We also just have some teams kind of coming up at the right time, and you have no idea how long that will actually last. But yeah, if you want to watch the major, it'll be on Twitch, twitch.tv/Call of Duty, I believe. Thankfully, we're still on Twitch. Should be some pretty big viewership numbers if I had to guess, especially if OpTic makes a little bit of a run with Scump and Methods now streaming, co-streaming during the games and whatnot. Although I don't know how it'll work because they'll be in Texas. I'm not sure what kind of setup they'll have, but it should be a great tournament nonetheless. But yeah, subscribe, like, follow the podcast wherever you're listening on or watching. We're on YouTube. We stream it live, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast every Tuesday night. We are also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, etc. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Follow us on Twitter. He is at jbink with 2 Ks. I am at Preston Byers, and the podcast Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. Next show will be March 13th or March 14th, where we will recap the third major of the CDL season, give our thoughts on whatever went down. We'll be talking about how I am such a genius that I picked the Seattle Surge, and Bink, he picked FaZe even though they got knocked out, double first rounded, which I kind of wanted to happen just for the craziness that would come from that. But yeah, we'll be back next week to talk about the third major and kind of look forward to the next round of qualifiers as we progress through the Call of Duty League season. But yeah, that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. Looking forward to the major this week, and I'm looking forward to whenever our follow-up show is, recapping it all for you guys. So hope you guys enjoy. Tune in to the major for sure if you want to see some high-octane gameplay, and then make sure to tune in to the Ego Chall if you weren't able to tune into any bit of the major, because we'll be talking about it all next week. So until then, take care, guys, and remember to send the chall.